speak for very long. The afternoon is going to be a quick hello from me and Rob, and then we're going to invite Sinead McBrearty to speak to us about the education support charity that supports all education professionals. Then after that, we've got James Bowen from NAHT, writer of NAHT's COVID advice that's gone out nationally. And I think if he's ever on Mastermind, his specialist subject will be schools in a time of COVID. And then at the very end, if you bear with us right to the end, 5 minutes of your time just to talk about Calderdale NAHT, whilst Rob and I fill you in and just pick off a few official boxes. So it's brilliant that you've joined us. We hope you'll find the afternoon interesting, useful, and supportive and reassuring as well. I know lots of names that have flashed up. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Judy Shaw. I'm the long-serving head of Tool Lane Infant School. I'm actually a co-head teacher there now in Sowerby Bridge. I'm also a national official at NAHT. I was last year's national president, so immediate past president now, and still very heavily involved and committed to support the profession through trade unionism and professional networks. Rob, do you want to say a quick hello?
Quickly unmute myself. Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Freeth. I want to very briefly go to introduce myself. I'm the branch secretary, the person that you go to if you've got any problems, or if you just want a bit of advice and a chat over something you're concerned about. But we'll come back to me at the end. I'm not going to take up any more time because I know Sinead has got a limited amount of time with us.
She has, so I'll introduce Sinead. So Sinead McBrearty is the CEO of Education Support. That's the charity that supports education professionals. And you've got access to this, which I'm sure Sinead will speak about, through your professional associations and networks, be it NAHT or other ones. There's never been a time when we've needed to reach out and know where we can source support for ourselves and for our staff as well. So I think you'll be uplifted by this. Please do use the chat function for both comments and questions all the way through and engage as much as you can. And as I say, I hope you find it.
Could you just let you one and you
and reassuring. So there's a timely reminder, keep yourselves on mute. I'm going to mute myself now and say hi to Sinead. Welcome, Sinead. Welcome to Calderdale.
Thanks a million, Judy. It's a pleasure to be here via South London. I imagine there's quite a different view out of all of our windows today. So as Judy said, I'm from Education Support. We are a charity that's been around for 140 odd years to set up by teachers for teachers. And we exist to support the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education. So as Judy mentioned, there is a support helpline that you can access through the NAHT. There's also a helpline that you can share with any member of your staff that is there 24/7. We've got trained counsellors on the end of the phone who know how to have conversations. People don't have to be in crisis to use it. They can just decide that it would be nice to reach out and speak to someone who's not in their own immediate circle for support. So that's one of the services that we offer. But we also provide workplace support for schools. We try and advocate for change. So we research the health and well-being of the education workforce, and then we try and get policymakers to change policies that we see affecting health and well-being. And that's obviously quite a dense job because there's quite a bit in that particular category for us to do, but we keep plowing away with it. But actually today I'm going to talk to you about yourselves and specifically about compassion and empathy and self-care and how that relates to well-being. And I come to that topic not as a neurologist or a psychologist. Now I wonder who's the host of this meeting, and can you give me permission to share my screen? If you can't, it's not a drama because I can still talk through, but if you can, I've got some slides I can share that might be, well, but it doesn't matter if it's not possible to let me do that. It is.
You should be able to now.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Sinead, just take this opportunity to remind people that the meeting's being recorded, so that if they don't want to appear, just please turn the video off at this point.
Lovely.
Thank you.
And can you all see some slides there? You can. Marvelous. Okay, in that case, let's crack on. So as I say to you, I'm coming into this as with the experience of working in the charity sector, supporting schools, supporting school leaders, supporting teachers, and that's really what informs this, alongside what we read and understand about from the literature. So I want to talk to you about compassion. And compassion, you know, many of you will know this, it literally means to suffer together. But in emotion research and psychological research, it's defined as the feeling you get when you are confronted with somebody else's suffering and you feel the motivation to relieve that suffering. So that point about motivation is something that we will come back to. A cousin of compassion is empathy. And empathy is a broad concept that refers to the cognitive and the emotional reactions that we have when we observe the experiences of other people. And well, for those of you who are interested in words, I think I've put the etymology of the word up there. It just struck me as mildly entertaining, that empathy is a German translation of a Greek concept. So I'm hopeful that post-Brexit, we will still be allowed to use empathy. I'm hoping that that's going to be allowed in whatever deal we end up with. But I would also draw to your attention that there are two types of empathy, and this is relevant. The first type of empathy that gets discussed psychologically is really an emotional response. So it's when we feel the same emotion as another person, or it might be when we experience distress because we perceive somebody else to be in a difficult situation, and we are relating to their experience. So that's an emotional empathic response. But there is also cognitive empathy. And that, I think, is particularly useful to us in our role as leaders. And that's where it's not about us feeling the feeling of other people, but it's about how well we can understand the emotions of other people. And so that our ability to empathize with other people is really positive. It's part of what connects us to others, and it is really positive for our well-being. So there are some pros and a couple of cons to this whole thing of empathy. But the positives are evidenced in the literature and matter at times like these. So empathy allows us to build our own ability to take in difficult experiences, the experiences of other people, and to do that without becoming overwhelmed. And that's important because in doing that, it builds up our ability to regulate our emotions. And emotional regulation is really important. If we cannot regulate our emotions, like you might know people who can't regulate their emotions very well, they can become very stressed. They can find that very difficult. And it sort of creates a spiral of stress. But through empathy, through being able to relate to others, we are building in ourselves the ability to regulate our own emotions. And that serves us in times of difficulty, becomes particularly useful. There is research in the social work field that demonstrates that the higher a person's empathic skills, then the lower their level of burnout that they experience in and through their work. And so this is quite important because, you know, we talk a lot about, and rightly so, we talk about emotional overload, but actually our ability to empathize, our ability to be empathic with others supports us to also be able to handle difficult situations. It gives us the muscle for that. And it also leaves us sort of stronger at communicating with other people and making sure that we are able to understand others, but also that we feel better understood. So in the round, from a workplace perspective, empathy is actually generally a pretty good thing. And our schools, as we know, are highly empathic places. So thinking about empathy is something I'm going to talk about, how you link it to your own well-being. Before I do that, I just want to, I suppose, highlight one thing, which is sometimes we can have a heightened emotional empathic response. All of us will recognize times when we have a very strong emotional response to somebody or to a situation that we're part of or we're observing. When that happens, we can get quite overwhelmed. And so this is why I wanted to distinguish between cognitive empathy, being able to think and understand how someone's feeling, and the felt response. So in the work that we do, it's really important that you don't become a sponge, because that in itself leads to compassion fatigue, and all of those things that we hear about. So there's a fine line to walk where empathy and compassion are really good for those around us. They're really good for ourselves, but we just want to be careful that we don't allow ourselves to be drowned in the emotional experience of other people or what we see happening around us. And at times like these, when people are really struggling, that can be very difficult. So if you find yourself in that situation, just remembering that point about the sponge and not wanting to be a sponge and trying to find the way to demarcate and boundary your time for yourself can be very helpful. So what difference, you know, I've highlighted empathy and compassion, and I suppose part of what I also wanted to highlight, because these are difficult times, is that there are moments when we might respond with empathy to others, and there are moments when it may not be appropriate for us to respond with compassion, with that desire to do things differently. So as leaders, as managers, there are times when we have a compassionate response to the people that we're working with, but that may lead us to overreach. It may lead us to want to fix something for other people. And in that situation, we are at risk of, in effect, trying to rescue the people that we're feeling the compassion toward, which ultimately, I suppose, can undermine or even infantilize those people. And so we hear a lot, through the helpline, we get a lot of responses of people thinking, I feel terrible for these individuals, somebody who works for me, they're having a difficult time. I want to make it better for them. But actually people ending up stepping in, doing too much for other people, and actually takes the individual that's working for them away from the sort of performance that they need. So I suppose being empathic, understanding how people feel, is really important. It allows you to reduce the heat or to reduce the defensiveness of somebody that you're working with, but you want to be careful that you don't step into kind of compassionate territory and try to fix things too much for them, because you can undermine their own ability and their own strength to respond. And I think that can also be important in the work that when we're with each other as colleagues, and the peer support that we provide. So being self-aware about your own response is really important to working through how you respond personally to others. The most important bit, it comes back to compassion and having compassion for yourself. I'm losing my voice. I've been in too many conferences today. So the point about self-compassion, that it is probably the one thing that I want you to take away today. There is a lot of research in the psychological literature around self-compassion being important for our well-being. It is linked to physical health and mental health to an extent that might be surprising if you haven't read about it. So self-compassion, the ability to be kind to ourselves, is demonstrated to speed up recovery from disease. And it's also proven to offer protection against disease. I'm going to just cough it for a minute. Forgive me here for a second. It's not a COVID cough. It's a speaking too many hours in the day cough. So there's research from Martin Seligman, from a whole heap of people in the psychological literature, that tells us that self-compassion, our ability to be kind to ourselves, directly affects our own health and our own health outcomes. So this is really the point, I think, for so many school staff at the moment, is how do we do that? How do we care for ourselves? And actually, what does it mean? And I suppose I would suggest that a sense of self-care and self-compassion has to start with an idea that self-care is not self-indulgence. There's a lot of research that also shows us that in caring professions, in public services, people feel like they can't really care for themselves because they need to look after the kids, or they need to look after the staff, or they need to look after who it is that's in their realm that they're caring for. And they put themselves to the bottom of the list. So I suppose the challenge today is to say that as leaders, actually the most important thing that you can be doing at the moment is to look after your own health, your own mental health and your own physical health, both because we know that it will enable you to do a better job ultimately, and it will keep you healthier, it is protective for you, but also in doing it, you're able to role model for other people what they need to do to stay well. If as leaders we role model working all the hours and not taking care of ourselves, then it won't matter what we say to those who work with us. They're not going to do those things differently. So recognizing that looking for mental health support or resources isn't a sign of weakness. It's a really smart strategy for staying well, using helplines and using support, exactly that. Recognizing that, you know, others who work for us will experience a whole heap of different things at the moment based on their personal circumstances. So they might be feeling despair, they may be in pain, there are plenty of people who are suffering significant loneliness. And I suppose if we come at this from an empathic and a compassionate perspective, then we also have to recognize that those are feelings that we're familiar with. There's nothing in that to be ashamed of, but recognizing it in ourselves and giving ourselves permission to recognize that allows us to be not just kinder to ourselves, but kinder to others. So that we don't, as leaders, get held to some kind of higher standard, you know, that it's okay for other people to feel these things. It's okay for other people to need support, but it's not okay for me because that's not in my job. And I think that's an attitude that we know many leaders have had, but that this circumstance around COVID is changing the way that we think about ourselves, and maybe is an opportunity to finally recognize that mental health and caring for ourselves isn't really anything to feel embarrassed about, anything to avoid. It's actually fundamental to us being able to do a good job. So if we then look in detail at what self-compassion is about, what does all of that really mean? Well, I've titled this slide More Than a Cinnamon Bun, and that's for this reason. I am personally, I suppose, reflecting on my own learning, I'm really, really good at looking after myself in certain ways. I have completely nailed the routine of self-care that involves having a good meal and a nice bottle of wine. I've got that down. Really, I'm excelling in that particular space. But during this second lockdown, I also noticed that I was struggling quite a bit. I found it quite difficult to deal with the constraints that were in place and so on and so forth. I missed my family a lot. It's been a long time since I've seen them, and I found it quite hard. And the working week became, seemed to get longer and longer. So I developed this Wednesday morning habit of walking to the corner. I take the kids to school, walk to the corner, get a lovely cinnamon bun from the bakery at the end of the road where they do a particularly nice cinnamon bun, bring it home and enjoy it with a cup of coffee, which became a sort of metaphor for I've got halfway through the week almost. It's cinnamon bun time. I can just take that little moment to do that one thing that I know I enjoy really well. But then you've got to kind of step back and reflect a bit. I'm not saying that I'm superficial, but so far I've talked to you about having food with wine and cinnamon buns. There is a particular level of self-care I'm operating at here, and it may not be the deepest bit. It may not address all of the things that we need to think about. And so by more than a cinnamon bun, what I mean is thinking through what does self-care mean actually, and what does the literature tell us? So I'm going to draw on some work that is cited on the slides, and you're welcome to them if you're interested in it. But the first element of self-care and self-compassion that we have evidence for in the literature is around being gentle and supportive and understanding toward yourself. Lots of us are really good at berating ourselves for our shortcomings. We're not so good at being kind to ourselves. So I can make a joke out of my love for food, and I can I can dismiss myself as being greedy and whatever else. I can be quite unkind to myself quite easily. But if I take this seriously and I am gentle and supportive and kind to myself, I might be able to pay attention to what's going on. In the moment where I reach for food, am I distracting from an anxiety? Am I fearful of something? Is there something that I'm doing in that moment that actually, if I start from a position of kindness, I might understand more about what's going on and be able to look after myself better? And that's really what self-compassion is trying to get at. In this window, with all that's going on around you, then finding the things that you enjoy doing, the things that make you feel good, and prioritizing them, being supportive of yourself in that way is a really important step. And if you do nothing else today, then commit to something that you will do today, before the end of the day, that is a nice thing for yourself. It doesn't have to be a big long thing. It can be a tiny moment. But in making that choice, then you're beginning the process of prioritizing that being caring of yourself. And we have to be realistic about what we can do. I love walking in the mountains. Ideally, I'd do that in Spain. Not really possible at this moment in time. So I can't have some kind of perfectionistic idea of what it is that I need to care for myself. There are plenty of small things that we can do for ourselves day in and day out, whether it's speaking to someone who we know is going to make us feel better, whether it's taking 3 minutes to go out to a plant and tend it, or whatever it is. Indeed, making yourself a meal you like counts too. But finding that thing that you care about doing and doing it is something that all of us can do and isn't going to take any great amount of time. The next thing in the literature that we've lots of evidence for being positive is around accepting that we are just human and that all humans fail. We all make mistakes. We all live imperfect lives. And if we allow ourselves to really take that in and hold that broader perspective on the fact that everybody is imperfect, then we can be much kinder to ourselves as a result. We have less sense of needing to be perfect because we understand we're in a community where nobody is. And that sounds very simplistic at the one level, but at another level, many of us, particularly leaders, are good at accepting that others have a need for support, but we hold ourselves to this kind of notion of a higher standard. If we were to have heads sacrificing themselves this year in the volumes that is possible, the cost would be far too great. And so I think in your case, feeling really clearly that you're part of a community and not one of you can fix COVID. You know, you can't fix it. You can't fix it for your community. You can't fix it for the families that you're most concerned about. You can't fix the social and economic fallout for them. There's loads that you can do, but those just aren't the things you can do. And so if you are trying to hold up the track and trace system in your community by yourself, that's an unrealistic burden on you. And there is a part of you needing to recognize that there's never going to be an easy moment to resist some of the workload at this point in time. But actually the trade-off is going to be, if you get so exhausted and so overwhelmed, you're not going to be able to do the things that only you can do in your role as a school leader, in keeping the place together and in keeping that sense of community. So distinguishing between reasonable demand and an unreasonable sense of what a perfect head teacher would do is helpful in this moment in allowing us to look after ourselves a little bit better. There's loads of evidence that tells us that staying in the present moment is really positive for our well-being, for this sense of being kind. And so when something is happening, and even if it's something very difficult, trying to stay in the moment and trying to stay, you know, not getting sucked into a lot of negative thinking about where that might spiral out to, and also not trying to distract, but allowing yourself to engage in it is part of looking after yourself. There's also the bit about how you stay present to yourself when you are not at school. Judy will have heard me say before, the opposite of working isn't not working. You know, you can be not working and your head can be full of lots of stuff, lots of distraction, lots of thought. You can be very absorbed, you know, you can get all bogged down in it, even though technically you're not working. In order to recover, you need to be present to something else. You need to allow yourself to become fully absorbed in something else, whether it's with your family, whether it means you take a dog for a walk and you really enjoy it and you look at the color of the leaves and you notice the sky and all that stuff. To allow yourself become fully absorbed elsewhere is hugely restorative and allows your whole body, including your mind, to recover from the demand and the stress of what's going on in the day job. So being present to your time off, if you like, is an important part of looking after yourself. And then the last point is that matters around self-compassion is you don't have to just be kind to yourself when you've done a good thing. You know, you don't just have to be kind to yourself when you've had a great day, you know, like you somehow deserve it. It's important that we learn to be kind to ourselves even when it's our fault. And I say fault in inverted commas because it's quite an unhelpful concept. But we sometimes think that there are times when we deserve kindness and times when we don't deserve kindness. And when I go back to that literature that points to the health benefits, the fact of, you know, how quickly you recover from stuff and your propensity to stay well, this idea of fault and these related concepts of guilt really matter. we need to stop judging ourselves, and we don't need anybody's special permission to be kind to ourselves. We get to do that just because we're humans, and that's all you need. Your permission is the fact that you exist, if you like, and it doesn't have to be any more special than that. But there is an abundance of research that will tell you that by doing these things and looking after yourself in a fuller way and with self-compassion is connected to lower levels of stress, lower levels of anxiety, and lower levels of depression. In doing these things, you get to stay well, and in staying well, you're able to resist some of the negative impacts of stress, which at a time like this is probably no bad thing to think about. The last thing just to say very quickly is this is also relevant in our roles as managers. So we know that life satisfaction, again, there's loads of evidence for this, life satisfaction is significantly affected by job satisfaction. It's a really like a quarter of your life satisfaction basically is wrapped up in your job satisfaction. So how people feel about their work really affects their overall sense of how happy they are in their lives. Job satisfaction is very significantly affected by interpersonal relationships. So that matters if you think about all the stuff about empathy. And in terms of interpersonal relationships, the vast majority, over 85% of that in kind of quantitative terms, is affected by the relationship with management. So management, going through this relationship, management have a massive impact on an individual's life satisfaction overall through the role of the job. So the positive to this is that in our roles as leaders and managers, we're able to make a massively positive impact for the people that we work with. And we do that in really simple ways, the most powerful of which is to recognize and acknowledge people. That in itself is a huge, underrated activity. And simply by doing that, we can make a direct impact on how somebody feels about their lives. So this is important stuff for us to hold in mind. But also, the research will tell us that you can learn to do this. So people can learn to do it. Our staff can learn to do it. It's not an intrinsic trait. Taking care of ourselves is something that we can learn to do. And in the culture in our schools, managers and leaders leading by example, making sure that their self-care is visible to others and they are committed to it, and normalizing mental health will go a huge way to creating a positive relationship and affecting the happiness of the people that you work with. I should also say that I'm going to skip this because we're kind of light on time. The last thing I wanted to say to you is this, that the education support helpline that I referenced is available to anyone in your schools who want, they can phone at any time, 24/7, everybody's welcome. We are here for the staff of schools up and down the country. And on our website here, there is a lot of resources on anxiety, on depression, on stress. There's films with psychologists and psychotherapists and all sorts of stuff that people might find useful. I think it is very easy at this particular point in time to look at the kind of wider environment, which we've just been talking about compassion. The wider environment is fairly devoid of compassion in education. It's become about meeting standards and inspections and all that stuff. And we think about learning environments around children, but actually when it comes to school staff, there is a high expectation of a kind of perfectionistic approach. There's no room for mistakes. It's very utilitarian. Andreas Schleicher from the OECD was quoted a couple of months ago talking about an industrial work environment for teachers in the UK, like a kind of factory. And I think it's very easy to see lots of examples of that. And that is the opposite of what we need in terms of empathy and compassion. That will drive isolation, which is really not positive. But the great news is that it is possible to make real change on that locally in your own school communities. So, and literally by starting to treat yourself with more kindness, you take a step in that direction and you start a journey with those around you that will build connection, build resilience, and build well-being. So in making what seems like a very tiny change, actually you can affect the culture in your school with a surprising amount of drama. It can make quite a big and positive difference. So I'd encourage you to go off and do something kind for yourselves today and next weekend and to build it into your routine and what you do. That's it, Judy.
Thanks, Sinead. Sinead, it's brilliant. I'm always, you really provoke my thoughts on that kind of thing. I'm going to give everybody just a second. If anybody wants to fire anything into the chat, any quick questions or comments, everything's really welcome. Sinead, one of my favourite things, and I bet you can guess, although I haven't seen you for a while, that I hear you speak about, and it's always worth reminding school leaders. I heard Sinead once ask us to reflect on how many interactions as school leaders we have in the course of a day. So you're at home and it starts with your own family and your responsibilities there. You land in school and then you've got every interaction with staff, with children, with families, with community, with outside agencies. We're on the go all day long. And that's when there isn't a global pandemic. We're explaining, we're appeasing, we're reassuring, we're supporting, we're developing, we're exhorting, all of those different things. And she described us to, she likened us to elite athletes in personal and social communications. And it's just, I love the phrase because I've never likened myself to an elite athlete in my life. But in personal and social communication, we're bordering on genius level. But on the other hand, that also takes so much inner strength, brain power, and our own empathy and compassion to be able to do that at the pace we do it. And now in a pandemic, the stuff that we've done since March, reacting to everything our communities, our schools, our government needed, how much is that sapping from inside us? So how important it is to take that time out and to not just be away from school, but your head is still in school, but to really perfect that ability to free your mind up. And I've tried to do it, and I liken it now to a form of catnapping. I can't switch off for the whole weekend. We're all too vibed up to do that. But I can sort of take useful catnaps of activity. I can grow veggies. And I know Sinead likens it to singing sad Irish ballads. I've heard her say that again. She can sing a sad Irish ballad, and while she's doing that for half an hour, she's absent from school and she's restoring herself. That's another talk that she does, and it just stays with me because I found it incredibly helpful, and I do think it's something you can learn. So in the chat there, you've got a big thanks, Sinead. Somebody saying that's really helpful. Is there anything else from anybody? Okay, I'm going to let you go off back into London, but it's lovely to see you again, and thank you ever so much, and stay well yourself, and you need to get that cough looked at as well, Sinead.
I will do. Thanks a million and take care. Look after yourselves. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye. And we'll make sure that that number and the contact for the education support charity is available to everybody. So I can see James Bowen. Hello, James.
Hello, Judy. Nice to see you.
Yeah, also welcome to Calderdale. I don't know if you've ever been to Halifax.
I have. Obviously not for the moment. This is the first time I've been to Halifax virtually, I have to be honest with you. And I'm going to be honest, I prefer it in person than virtually.
Well, everybody.
Much nicer being there than staring down the camera.
Well, if you were here, we'd take you for a nice coffee in our beautiful Peace Hall, which is something...
It's easy to promise that when I'm not there, Judy. I'm going to hold you to that next year.
I'll owe you a brew next time. So I did introduce you earlier on, but this is James Bowen. He's been just an incredible force of nature, really, throughout the COVID. I don't know what he used to do before COVID came along, but since it did, he's NAHT's Director of Policy. He runs a team that are incredibly impressive and knowledgeable about all aspects of schoolwork. But James has devoted himself to writing all the advice that's come out of NAHT. I know his team are behind him as well, the frequently asked questions and everything. And he is our resident expert, so I'm going to hand over to him. James, I'm hoping that you'll give us the latest update on COVID, but also fill us in on our ongoing campaigns and how hard we're trying with to get answers and clarity on assessment, on accountability, Ofsted, SATs, exams and everything. Yeah, so I'll hand over to you. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Judy. I love that phrase. I don't know what you used to do before COVID. I think the way that COVID has dominated everybody's working professional lives at the moment, we kind of look back and think that, but goodness me, it was, you know, school leaders, let's say, had enough on their plate before COVID came along, and therein lies one of the key problems, doesn't it? You know, the layer upon layer of additional responsibility, but I'll come on to that. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me along. I do hope that maybe this time next year I can be there in person if you do invite me again. It's not the same staring down a camera. as it is being there and seeing people. So hopefully this time next year, if things go in the right direction, I will actually be there. And I hope you're well. I heard Judy say at the beginning about how that's kind of shifted from being a pleasantry to a loaded question these days, I think, hasn't it? But I genuinely hope you're doing okay in what are, frankly, just about the most challenging times that I think we can remember when it comes to being a school leader. I mean, we've used the phrase before, which perhaps sounds a bit like hyperbole, but we've talked about this being the biggest challenge that school leaders have faced since 1945. And actually, the more I think about it, the more I think that's absolutely true. I think the types of problems and the complexity and the challenges that this generation of school leaders that you're having to deal with are ones that nobody has ever had to face before. And I think we're at the stage where just simply getting through to the end of each day and coming back in the following morning in itself is just an enormous achievement. And I did catch a little bit of what Sinead was saying there. And I think remembering actually just to congratulate ourselves for getting through each day at the moment in itself is something we need to remember to do. Because I think so much of the job of a school leader now does just revolve around COVID. You know, I don't have to tell you, but the sheer amount of work that goes into keeping the schools safe, the track and tracing, the dealing with cases, working with staff and parents who are understandably anxious, it is all consuming at the moment. And as we've already kind of alluded to, it wasn't as if there wasn't an awful lot on your plate to begin with. I think one of the things I'd say is becoming increasingly clear is that over the last couple of weeks in particular, I think the pressure on schools is becoming increasingly intolerable. And in turn, the pressure on school leaders has ratcheted up enormously in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks. That's not to belittle what was going on before. I think the pressure's been immense throughout, but we have definitely noticed a shift. And I think that sort of coincides with the increasing case numbers again, the positive cases going up and up in the last month or so, and if you like, the cumulative effect of all the pressures that schools are under, you know, and the amount of work that's going on in terms of the track or tracing, the working with families. So we've certainly been saying to the government in the last couple of weeks, look, schools really are at breaking point. And if something doesn't give very, very soon, we think there's a real chance schools will start to go under because the pressure has just got to that intense level, and it can't carry on. And I think for me, if you like, what we can do is we can separate that pressure into 2 categories, if you like. There's the immediate pressure of dealing with COVID, all the things you know about, that having to deal with calls at weekends into the evenings of positive cases, having to work through half term, the pressure of working with staff who have understandable anxieties and parents with very different views about what you should be doing, because nobody's ambivalent when it comes to COVID. Everybody has very passionate views, and the pressure that surrounds that. And then there's the second category, which I think, if you like, is the slightly more sort of pernicious pressure, but no less acute, which is all the unnecessary burdens around things like the spectre of Ofsted returning in January, SATs, performance data, all those, if you like, usual pressures and burdens, which really are pernicious. And those are the ones I think are very much within the government's gift to very quickly deal with. Now, of course, we want them to deal with both. I'm not suggesting it's one or the other. But the latter category, we're saying that you could very, very quickly deal with some of those pressures and just take a little bit of heat out of the system. It won't fix everything. And I'll give you an update on where we are with some of those around Ofsted and SATs and what have you. And we are in a position where this really is, if you like, breaking news. I don't know. Apologies. I meant to listen to Sinead, but you may have seen I had to hang up because I had a phone call, because we are really at the point of, within the next couple of days, finding out what's going to happen on some of those key issues. So I'll say as much as I can around those, but just to reiterate, we are at decision point now in the next sort of 48 to 72 hours. Just to give you kind of what we've been trying to do, I guess Judy's alluded to it, in terms of how we've been trying to support members throughout this. I think what became abundantly clear to us right back in the beginning of March, frankly, was that the Department for Education and the government were going to be far too slow when it came to getting guidance out to schools. And actually, even when that guidance came out, most of the time it wouldn't be particularly very useful. And there was a vacuum, very clearly a vacuum there. And we had to make a decision. And what we decided to do NHD was that we'd have a go at filling that vacuum. So we've been trying really hard to get out quick, concise, what I hope has been useful guidance to members, the feedback we're getting is that has been the case, that people have found that quite useful. There's always been that challenge in terms of getting out as quickly as possible, but also making sure it's accurate. What we don't want to do is write something to members and then within 24 hours the government completely contradict it, because that just causes more confusion for people. But I'm pleased to say I think just about every single time we've managed to get out ahead of government. Now I know that's not much of an achievement given how poor the DfE have been getting their stuff out, but there have been a few occasions as well where we've written something and a few days later they've published something that looks remarkably similar to what we've written. Now I have to say that's not been the case for all of it. All their terrible advice I'm not going to take the blame for, but there has been a number of occasions where it has looked very, very familiar, and we'll keep doing that. So one of the things that happens at the moment, we receive from members each week literally hundreds of different questions. We're well into the thousands, if not tens of thousands, since March. And what we're trying to do is get answers on those questions as quickly as we can. We go back to members, but then we also publish those answers. So on our website, we've got a sort of frequently answered questions page, which goes through everything, if you like, from ventilation to size of bubbles, to clinically extremely vulnerable staff. Just whenever a question is asked, if we can answer it, we put it straight up, or what we can quite often do is go to the Department for Education and get a quick answer before it's published in their guidance, and we put it on there as well. So I hope if you've been accessing those, they've been useful to you. So that's basically what we've been trying to do to help. Let me sort of go through some of the live key issues, and there are so many of them. We could be here all night if I were to go into detail on all of them. So it will be by sort of necessity a whistle-stop tour, and I will sort of skim the surface, but I'm happy to stick around and try and answer questions. Let me start by talking about, if you like, that first category, and I want to talk a bit about sort of the track and trace and all the stuff that goes around that, really. Just to reassure you, we are still putting a lot of pressure on government around the actual testing system itself. Clearly in September, it was nothing short of an abject failure. And we made it very clear at that point, if it didn't get fixed, that frankly, the sustainable return to schools was at risk, that schools would not stay open, that schools needed that test and trace system in place. What I think we're seeing at the moment is, in terms of the testing side of things, in most parts of the country, it has improved since September. I mean, it was a pretty low starting point, to be fair, but what we are now seeing is in most parts of the country, people are able to access a test pretty quickly. And they're able to get the results reasonably quickly. I think the latest data we saw was something like 3/4 getting results within 24 hours. Now, I don't know if that's the case where you are. Obviously, there are geographical inconsistencies, but we're carrying on pushing that. You know, we need to see that. We need to see 100% of people, frankly, getting results as quickly as possible. And what we're really now pushing on as well is the government. We're asking the government to think about kind of using those immediate tests, the tests whereby schools with particular challenges could get their community tested and get results within the sort of 15 minutes, those rapid testing kits you've seen about. So we're again pushing on that. So that's around the testing side of it. The Dfe Helpline, which some of you may have had the misfortune to have to call, we do still have really significant concerns about that. And I think it's fair to say that most of our concerns are on the expertise and the ability of the people who are answering those calls, frankly. And it seems to be a case of some people are getting through to people who are very good. And we've had lots of feedback where members say, actually, I got through to someone, they gave me exactly the advice I needed. I was able to put it in place and off we went. That was fine. Equally, we're hearing from some people who are saying their experience has just been awful. They've got through to someone who clearly doesn't know what they're doing, is just reading off a script, doesn't really even understand the script. I think the worst example was where someone phoned the advice line and was told by the person at the other end, I'm afraid we can't offer you any advice, which does rather beg the question, what is the point of an advice line? So again, we are pretty much every day speaking to them about that, asking to see the numbers of people who are calling. We're giving them feedback constantly on that, and we were able to get some changes through. So for example, there was a stage when it was first set up where members were saying, look, if I call back for a second time, I'm told, why are you calling us? You've already phoned the hotline, you don't need to call back. Clearly, that was entirely inappropriate. We said to DfE, look, if members need to phone second time for advice because there's a second case, they should get it. And they removed that from the call handler's script as a result. So I appreciate that they're little victories, but it's just to give you a flavour how, you know, when members tell us that things aren't right, we do go back to them and we can get some of them fixed. But clearly there is a lot of work to do, I think, based on on the feedback we're still getting around the helpline not being anywhere near where it should be. And then I should talk about the app as well, I think, because obviously we're now seeing staff in schools using the app, and that has caused some issues, I think it's fair to say. Some of the feedback we've had from members has been concerns around whether or not the app is taking into account all the protective measures that are in schools, and some schools getting odd notifications where members of staff in the school all getting notifications very rapidly, one after the other, even when they're relatively confident they haven't spent any time together, albeit in school or out of school. So we've been having conversations with the team behind the app to feed that back in as well. One of the things that is important to say, and I'm sure people are already conscious of this, what the app providers have said to us is when it's being used in school by staff, if staff don't have it on their person, they should turn off the tracking capability. The reason for that is there have been quite a number of cases where when we've looked into it and unpicked it, what's happened is that the staff will put their mobile phones in a locker at the beginning of the day, and of course they're all within a metre of each other and they're all just sort of pinging, or even staff put it in their desk drawer and that happens to be adjacent to the desk in the next door room through a stud wall, and so it thinks they've been in contact. So we are saying that, you know, obviously in those situations turn it off, although what we're not advising is people to ignore the notifications. We did have a few schools say, oh, can I tell my staff just to ignore the notifications because I think we've got measures in place. Clearly that's not a good idea for obvious reasons. It would only need a member of staff to become ill in the weeks that follow, and people could be in a really vulnerable position. So we're obviously not advising people to do that. And then the final thing around this topic, and probably the one that I think really is causing me most concern at the moment, and again, it links into the conversations you've been having with Sinead all around well-being, and it's the fact that school leaders have effectively sort of been co-opted to become an integral part of the track and tracing system in a way that nobody ever signed up to. The fact that it's now school leaders who are having to do the tracing, that they're having to take phone calls in the evening, weekends, holidays. They're effectively, you know, propping up Public Health England in that sense and doing the job of Public Health England. And we've been saying to the DfE, this is not sustainable. You know, I think we all recognise that school leaders have information around the bubbles that they would need to share, but they cannot be on call 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And we're in pretty intensive talks at the moment about Christmas, and us saying, look, school leaders need to be able to switch off over Christmas. They cannot be taking calls throughout the Christmas holiday doing track or tracing. I think we're hopefully making some progress on that, and I'm hoping something will come out quite soon that will kind of make it clear that school leaders should get a break. It's one of those ones where we're pushing for it to be much stronger and harder than they would like, and those conversations are very live. But I think what we do need is school leaders to be able to switch off and step back. You know, as you all know, and I suspect many of you on the call will say, you know, you've worked pretty much every day since beginning of March, and people are going to need a bit of a break over Christmas. So just to reassure you, we are really working hard on that issue. If I go into some of the kind of the broader areas, that second category, if you like, the kind of those pernicious pressures I was talking about, let me start with Ofsted. We have a very clear position on this, which is that we don't think there should be any return to routine inspection for the rest of this academic year. We just think that given everything that's going on in schools at the moment, given the pressure that people are under, the very last thing anybody needs is an inspector to turn up for 2 days and start doing deep dives into the history curriculum, for example. You know, that would be entirely inappropriate. And I think the reality is it's not only that it would be inappropriate, but frankly, it's now clearly becoming impossible. If you look at the current inspection framework, it is clearly impossible that they would just be able to turn back to that in January and start doing deep dives and meeting groups of teachers and going classroom to classroom. So we've taken a pretty hard line with Ofsted on this. We've been speaking to them and the Department for Education on almost a daily basis in the last few weeks and months, in fact, to make that point. And what we've been saying is that people need an urgent announcement on this, you know, that actually all this sort of waiting just keeps the pressure there. And actually they could very quickly come out and just make it clear that that's not going to happen. Now, we've had some good news this morning on that. I'm sure probably nobody spent their morning watching the Chief Inspector's speech this morning, because you've all got much better things to do. But it was an important part in that, in which he confirmed that there would be no return to routine inspection in January. Now, bearing in mind, that's the position we started with, was that they were coming back in January. I think that's an important step. But we're not naive. We're not going to say that's job done. But they, as I say, they've confirmed no return to routine inspection, no graded inspections in January. What we are now doing, and the phone call I was taking then was about, well, what are they talking about doing for the rest of this academic year, just to make sure there's sort of no sting in the tail. So, you know, the headline is encouraging. We need to now get underneath the detail of that, and that will be for the next few days. And I think we're expecting a kind of clearer announcement on that by the end of the week. So we're hoping really that our kind of work around that and all the pressure we've been sort of bringing to bear will pay off. And it's a similar story when it comes to primary SATs and statutory assessment, really, which is, again, we have a very clear position. We had our virtual annual conference about 6 weeks or so ago now, and members were pretty strong. I think it was almost unanimous, if it wasn't unanimous, in saying that there should be no primary statutory assessment this year. So that is the position we've taken. We've made some pretty robust arguments, and I think some pretty strong arguments, to the Secretary of State directly, to officials within the Department for Education and other people in government for why it shouldn't happen. Not least of which because the idea that you could in any way do a school-to-school comparison with that data this year is a complete nonsense. You know, we all know that there'll be schools where pupils have been out for 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks for isolating. There'll be other schools where just by the luck of draw, they won't have been out hardly at all. And to compare those two schools based on their SATs data would be, I mean, deeply, deeply unfair. So we're pushing that really hard. And we're also saying, of course, that it's not just about the SATs, but there should be no performance data either. What we don't want to see is the government say, well, we'll scrap SATs, but everybody still has to do teacher assessment, and we'll use that in performance tables, and we'll use that in analysing school performance, because in a sense that's almost worse, see the amount of pressure that would then be brought to bear on that data. So our argument is very strong: no SATs and no performance data. This is another one where I think we are hopeful of an announcement. I'm going to cross my fingers and say by the end of the week. I'm probably saying more than I should do here. So we haven't got any journalists on this call, have we, Judy? Just to check that you know of. I'm going to assume not. So basically, I think we're at the stage now where we are waiting for this to be signed off by the Prime Minister. So that's to give you a sense of where it is. It really is at the final stage of sign off. Now, the only thing about that is that also fills me with dread to a certain extent, because we have been in this position a few times before where we're waiting for the things to get signed off by number 10 and they don't always come back exactly how we'd like them to. But I think it's fair to say we have emphasised the urgency of this. We've been very clear about our position. And of course, in terms of the urgency, we're saying, look, we need an answer because this is happening now. We've got the year 2 phonics check taking place right now. You know, people are obviously having to go through that at the moment, hence why it's so urgent. So hopefully within a matter of days, we'll get a clear picture on that, and members will be able to look and see, okay, what is it that the government have kind of put on the table? What I hope is they will take our arguments entirely. If they don't, how far have they been prepared to go? And then I think we'll all want to look very carefully at that. To another subject, and apologies for jumping around, but these are all important and there's no easy segue. But the next one really I want to talk about is funding. Again, I think we've been pushing incredibly hard on this. Our campaign has been that all schools should be fully reimbursed for all the additional COVID costs they've incurred. We saw some, what I think were pretty disingenuous statements from ministers earlier on. I think the worst one was where we had the schools minister saying, well, schools have had very generous budget settlements this year and they can afford to pay for the COVID costs out of that. Now, most of you are on mute, so I can't hear what you're saying, but I can imagine some of the words that might be probably similar to the ones I used. You know, firstly, in terms of the generosity of the settlement, well, an awful lot of schools got 1.8% increase this year, which won't feel incredibly generous. But in a sense, that's almost a secondary issue. But the main argument we've made is that you set those school budgets prior to COVID. So when you set those school budgets, that was the amount of money you felt schools needed to provide an education to pupils. if we are now having to reallocate that money, and in some cases that's tens, even pushing hundreds of thousands of pounds for COVID measures, that is money that is being taken away from pupils' education. And I think that's the reality of the situation. We did have, again, it's one where we saw a bit of a glimmer of light on Friday. I don't want to overplay it. And I think, you know, if we were being generous, we would call it a glimmer of light or a step in the right direction, but probably no more. And that was the announcement on Friday that they would launch a scheme to begin to reimburse some schools for their supply costs. Now, it's nowhere near as comprehensive a package as we've been calling for. It only covers supply costs, and there are limitations, significant limitations around, you know, the fact that if you've got to take what they're calling a budget surplus, you can't call on that. And that certainly doesn't go far enough for us, but it is a glimmer of light, and it does mean that some of the schools in the most perilous financial position will be able to claim back some of their costs for supply. So, as I say, we're pleased to see that happen. It's better than nothing, but we're certainly not resting on our laurels, and we will redouble our efforts to make sure that that goes further, because we know that's exactly what our members are telling us. I'll finish off with two last things. One is GCSEs and A-levels. I know we may well have secondary members on the call, or people just interested in that, obviously after the mess that we all saw last summer. We've been heavily involved in those conversations. We've been frustrated that it's taken them so long to come out with an announcement. We keep saying to them, look, for those secondary schools who are teaching GCSEs and A-levels now, and the colleges that are doing that, they're in the middle of it, and they need to know, they need absolute clarity about what's happening next summer, because every day they wait at the moment is a day lost in that sense. And we're saying to them that, you know, simply burying your head in the sand and just hoping that all exams will go ahead as normal in itself is not a solution, that we need contingency measures in place, and we need some clear measures in place to make sure it's fair for those pupils next summer who have missed huge amounts of education. So again, following the talks we're having, I think we are expecting that later this week, the announcement around that will come out too. It is, you know, far later than we'd like to see, and I think if nothing else, we'll be heavily critical of that, but we'll be looking carefully at what the exact proposals are. And then finally, let me just sort of finish maybe on the topic of vaccines, because I think that's so topical. I think we've all got our sort of fingers crossed that the news around the vaccine is as good as perhaps it looks like the media are suggesting it could be. I can't help but there's a part of me that remains very skeptical. You know, we've had lots of big promises and they haven't been delivered over the last 9 months, and so I think I feel a bit jaded. But fingers crossed, this is one where we will see, you know, the promise living up, or the delivery living up to the promise, I should say. What we're saying to government on this is that we think that education staff absolutely deserve to be prioritised when that rollout happens. I think, you know, we all would recognise that the most clinically extremely vulnerable, those with underlying medical health conditions, should of course be right at the front of the queue. And alongside them should be the NHS frontline workers who are in hospitals and what have you. I don't think any of us would dispute that. But what we're saying is it's very hard to see many other professions after that have a better case for being, you know, right at the front of the queue than the education profession, particularly the way they've been on the front line throughout, and the government are continuing to ask them to be in schools on the front line. So we're pushing that very, very hard, both around vaccines and also around routine testing. And we've been involved in monitoring some of the trials of routine rapid testing, where we've had schools where the entire school, all staff and all pupils, have been tested on a daily basis, and seeing how that could be rolled out next year as well. But I thought with the vaccine issue being so live, I just wanted to sort of mention that, because I'm sure some people will probably be asking, you know, what are NAHT doing on this? So just useful to make our position clear. So as I sort of said at the beginning, I have rattled through that, Judy, and I know you asked me to cover a lot of ground, so I've done it probably a bit rapidly. And apologies if I've skimmed over some things. I'm conscious that there's an awful lot of stuff I haven't even said, things like, you know, maintain nursery schools we haven't touched on, Judy, and others. But if I go on, I'll be still here at midnight, and nobody wants that.
All right. We haven't actually got any maintained nursery schools, but that's fine. There's a couple of comments coming in, and we'll give people a chance to, and we can use the chat function on now. If you want to reveal yourselves and wave at me, I can see who wants to speak. I've got one question in for you, James.
Okay.
It's from Debbie, who's, I think she's head of one of our special schools, actually. And it's, what's your view on immunity passports? We've got a lot of support staff who are saying that they'll refuse the vaccine.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we haven't, it's fair to say, we don't have an NAHT view on this. It's not sort of something we've sat down and discussed, mainly because it hasn't sort of, it's only really become a live issue, I guess, in the last couple of days. So anything I'm about to say is probably going to be a personal view, so I should caveat that. But I think you're right. I think I'm genuinely worried about that. The number of schools who I speak to where they say, well, look, the reality is a significant proportion of my staff, for whatever reason, have just said that they're not going to have it. And in that case, I'm not sure it's going to be particularly helpful to schools if we say you can only come in if you've got one of these passports, or you have to prove something. And otherwise, we're going to put schools in a kind of worse position, aren't we? Where schools are going to effectively have to close because people haven't got the immunity passports. I haven't heard anything from the Department of Education or government suggesting they would be considering that. It's much more a kind of, it's going to be optional. We want people to do it, but we're not going to mandate anyone to do it. And if they're not going to mandate it, I don't see how they could prevent people going to work or working in schools. I mean, I guess my personal view is I just really hope that, I understand people's worries, but you would hope the vaccine's proven to be safe that as many people as possible would take up on that, because it's the only way it's going to work, isn't it, if we get a significant take up. So sorry, that's more me thinking out loud than giving you any definitive advice. And I'd be interested, I'd be interested to know Debbie's views on it, because it might be that, I think we're at the stage where we all need to think about it.
Debbie, are you there? What do you think?
Hi, I'm here.
Hey, Debbie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I think I've spoken to public health about this, James, and I think that the messages that come out to staff in schools is going to be really, really important. And I think that the messaging needs to be simple, and I think it needs to be optimistic. And I'm very, very concerned, having seen some of the messages that have come out centrally, that it won't be handled with that view that there are some very scared, very anxious, very nervous people. I love the idea of an immunity passport, because I think we need a bit of put pressure on some people, but to be quite honest, my sister, who's a senior person within the NHS, is when I speak to her, I feel that I'm at such an advantage because I understand the vaccine programme. I understand that it's locally, it's starting next week with staff in healthcare trusts in Calderdale. So I feel that I come at it with a really optimistic view, and I'm very conscious that as a school leader, I have quite a lot of influence actually amongst my staff, and I want to be given some really clear advice, because they will be expecting something to come from me. They've expected it about testing, they've expected it about PPE. And to be quite honest, I know that I can influence this one way or another. So I would just like some really clear, simple guidance that does understand everyone's point of view on this, that I can be disseminating to my staff without putting undue influence on people and obviously, exploiting my position. So yeah, it's my hot topic at the minute, I'm afraid, because I'm just desperate for people to get on board and get back to some kind of normality. But being shocked, it's a bit like finding a Tory amongst your staff. When I find these anti-vaccinators, I think, oh my God, they actually exist. I didn't know that. It was like the day I found out people voted Conservative. So yeah, it's been the same sort of approach, I'm afraid. So yeah, I am hoping that just something comes out for school leaders, because we will get asked to this. Our staff are looking to us to be the experts on everything at the moment, and we're being asked all sorts of questions. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate it might not be something.
No, it's really useful, and I think that's me feeding back into the sort of the government as well about the messaging that goes out to schools around, look, this needs to be a positive message, but it also needs to acknowledge that people are anxious and nervous, and that, I guess at that point about, I think you make a really good point there, that some people who wouldn't in ordinary times consider themselves anti-vaxxers, they wouldn't be part of that, but are still worried about this because they're saying, but it's a new vaccine, it hasn't been trialed and I think, I guess, sort of acknowledging that as well, and asking the DfE to think about how they kind of acknowledge that, but still give a positive message and give school leaders answers, whether it's FAQs or etc., to pass on to staff, could be really helpful. So no, thank you, Debbie. Really
Thanks, James.
useful.
I've got, I'm going to test your optimism levels now. Now, I've known you quite a long time and you're quite a cheery, optimistic chap, but Paul from Car Green's asking, James, you described Friday's funding doc as a glimmer of hope. How optimistic are you that the government will actually change their mind about refunding COVID costs? Oof.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to get people's hopes up unnecessarily, because I need to be honest with you and say it was an immense battle to get to where we got, if I'm honest with you, at that stage. So, you know, the Treasury is clearly currently really worried about the amount of money that it is spending across the board on all sorts of things, and they are definitely looking for every opportunity to not pay out any more money. And I think their point about, you know, the point the Treasury made to us was, look, and I'll rehearse their line, it's not my line, but they said, look, you know, if schools are based on sort of public money, and if schools have public money available to them that hasn't been used, we want them to use that first before we give them more money. Now, I know we all have our views about that, and it's far more complex than that, but that is the reality of the challenge we've got. And I think we've got a battle on our hands. You know, I think it won't be easy to get more money out of them. It was really hard in the summer to get the initial scheme set up, and it was even harder, I would say, to get it set up in the autumn. That being said, what we have found is all the evidence we've presented them with. So like when we've got that survey data in from members, when we've collected all that, when we've had the petition, that kind of pressure has built up and they haven't been able to resist it. So we've got them to do something in the autumn term that they didn't want to do already. I think, you know, we've got to keep trying to get them to do more, but it's going to be tough, and it would be unreasonable of me, Paul, to sit here and go, oh, you know, it'll be there in a week's time, because I think it's going to be hard. So thanks. I don't know. Then if you want on a scale of 1 to 10 or what, or a percentage.
Not the most optimistic I've ever heard him, unfortunately. I think it's what I've heard from yourself and from Paul Whiteman. These are not the easiest bunch of people to be working with, are they? And right throughout the whole crisis, if the Department for Education has firmed something up, it's been coshed on the head by number 10. And the usual lines of power and communication just don't operate with this government, do they?
I mean, I'll go into, just to give you a flavour of that, it's been so frustrating. The number of times where we've worked on something with the DfE, a piece of guidance, and we've sort of got to a point where we've said, actually, that's okay. It's not perfect. It's not what we want, but get it out to schools now. They need this and we can live with this. It's all right. And then it goes into what they call their sign-off process. The sign-off process in government, I've learned more about government processes than I ever wanted to know, but the sign-off process, it leaves the DfE. It then has to go through the Cabinet Office with our dear friend Michael Gove. It has to go through Public Health England, understandably. It has to go through the Treasury. It has to go through number 10. Quite often it also has to go through the Department for Health and Social Care. So you've then got 5 layers of government departments all giving their 2 pence worth. And the number of times, it's by the time we've seen it published, we've said this does not resemble anything like the piece of guidance we thought we were signing off on. Not signing off, we don't get to sign off, but you know, that we saw. And in a strange sense, and it's really hard to say, I once tried saying this on Twitter, and I thought, you know, people aren't going to, I have some sympathy with some DfE officials on this, and that, you know, people go, what? You know, DfE have been awful, and in lots of ways they have, don't get me wrong. But there have been a number of times where these decisions have been frankly taken out of DfE's hands, and they've put something quite sensible together, only to be completely ignored or changed by number 10 and others. But you know, I'm not asking for sympathy for DfE officials. I think I'll be on a losing wicket with that one.
They've not had control over their own business.
No.
Listen, I've got another question. This is Rob Freeth, James, is our branch secretary. He's a retired head teacher and wonderful support.
Thank you for that. Hi, James.
Hi, Rob.
One of the most frequent concerns I get brought to me regards staffing and keeping schools open. I think there's hardly a school around that hasn't had problems with staff being away, either because they've tested positive or because they're having to go into self-isolation and so on. What's the position if a school gets to a point where they just cannot keep the school, they cannot guarantee the safety of the children because there are so many staff off at one time. I think this is something that's a particular concern to small schools. Now, I had begun by saying to heads, well, I believe it's the same as if you've got really bad weather and staff can't get in for snow. If you've not got enough staff to guarantee the safety of the children, then you as head have got the right to close the school. But I have heard that Nick Gibb, the lovely Nick Gibb, has said that under no circumstances should schools be closed for any reason. So I just want to know what our position is.
So, I mean, our position is basically kind of what you said, that we are still maintaining the position, which is that if, you get to the school on a Wednesday morning and you've got 2 teachers and 12 classes and you cannot safely open to that, like you would on any other day, if there was a, pre-COVID times, if there was something awful that happened and staff couldn't get to school, you would have to make that short-term judgment. I suppose the caveats to that are, number one is it's important that it's kind of a short-term judgment, right? So you'd almost say, I'm taking that decision for today and I'll review it again for tomorrow. Not that, I'm closing for the next 3 weeks. It's almost, it has to be short-term. I think the second thing is that what's slightly different is that in normal times you would just do that, wouldn't you? And I think what we're saying now is as soon as possible, or even when you're getting close to that, get in contact with the local authority and cover your back a little bit. Phone the LA, or if you're an academy, phone trust, say, I'm getting close to this position. This is where we are. Is there anything you can do to help me first? You almost have to kind of, I think, show you've exhausted those options, and it may well be they go, no, nothing we can do to help. So I think those two, it's short term, go to the local authority, go to the trust, let them know you're doing it. And the reason I'm saying those things is because you're right, we know that schools are coming under pressure. So we know that where schools are being forced to close, the regional schools commission or whoever's kind of getting on the phone saying you need to open back up. And I think that's why doing that preemptive stuff is saying, look, I've got 2 staff left, I've spoken to my local authority, what solution have you got? If you've got 8 staff you can give me for tomorrow, etc., being a bit facetious, but please do. But I think the bottom line still remains for us, if as a school leader you don't think it's safe, and I know that's always a judgment call, but if you get to stage where you think this is dangerous and I have to close for a year group, you'll have to do it, but keep it as a short-term thing. And I guess the other point is, can you close maybe 1 year group? So it might be actually I can stay open for R1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but I've got to close for year 6. So I think it's a case of kind of really showing you've done everything you possibly can. You've exhausted all avenues, you've consulted all the people. But ultimately, if you get to that point, it is still the point. What I think is reality is it won't be very long before you start getting phone calls from someone asking about it. Hence why I'm sort of saying to do all that prep work at the beginning. Does that help, Rob? Does that sort of tie in with?
Thanks, James.
Very much so. Thank you, James.
I'm just going to bring Louisa in briefly. Louisa is our regional officer for NAHT.
Hello, it's lovely to see everybody virtually. Rob, I'm not sure if it assists or not, but I can say for definite that there are schools in other parts of the region and different authorities that have had to close, of varying sizes actually as well. And I would say, exactly as James has said, we would advise that the steps that he has outlined would be taken. We haven't been involved in those closure decisions, but it certainly isn't the case that schools around Yorkshire are not closing in full because of COVID for short periods of time. You can imagine that in quite small schools in particular, where they are one bubble, it has been the case that sadly COVID has sometimes affected, beyond 50% of staff at one go, sadly sometimes, and so they just haven't been able to stay open for that reason. But also some quite big schools in other authorities have simply for one reason or another just not got the staff to stay open. So I'm almost more surprised that hasn't happened yet in Calderdale at all. I'm not sure if that's reassuring or otherwise, but Calderdale has been quite badly hit by COVID, so it's much more common that 1 year group or one key stage or whatever else shuts for a short period of time, but schools closing is definitely happening within Yorkshire, sadly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lisa. We are running short of time now, so I'm going to, James, there's a couple of comments. Somebody's put, I've really relied on your updates. Thank you.
Okay.
So that's a heartfelt thanks from all of us in Calderdale. I've got to draw it to a close. Thanks ever so much for coming up, even if it was virtually. It was very nice to see you. And you too, Louise. I haven't seen you for ages either. And it's great to know that you're there on the end of the phone line. So keep up the good work. I don't think you get to put your feet up yet, James, do you?
Even when I do get to my feet up, I've got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, as you know, so there's no putting up the feet. That's
everybody else. NAHT offices are based in Haywards Heath, just near Gatwick, and they've not worked in the offices for ages, so they're all spread about the south of England and the north in our regional offices cases. So it's different and challenging for everybody in different workplaces. James, it's lovely to see you. Thank you very much, and we'll catch up with you soon. Thank you. Everybody else, don't go away, because whilst we've got a group of heads gathered together as members, if you're a member that is, we just crave your indulgence for the last 5 minutes, please, so we can go through a little bit of local business. Natalie, do you want to lead us a little bit through this?
Yeah, just really, I mean, it was just to get a brief update from Rob, I think, on the branch over the past year. I believe that you had decided on the executive that the people who are in the officials roles were going to continue on for the following year because of the
fact we need to get the branch just to approve this. Normally we would have done this at an AGM, but obviously these aren't normal times. We just want to get sort of your approval that we continue with our current sort of executive committee. That's David Perrin at Hepton Stall as president, Judy's vice president at the moment, Gretel Young at Hebden Royd is treasurer, and myself as branch secretary. So unless anybody objects, could we propose that we continue with that? Is there anybody who violently objects to any of the 4 of us carrying on?
Or anybody else that wants to do it instead?
Yeah. This doesn't preclude anybody else who getting involved with us. We're always welcome anybody else joining us, but so
we love that. We meet as a little coven up in Hebden Bridge, and we talk a lot of educational policy. So anybody, it would be really, really good if anybody wanted to join us and broaden out our local executive, because we've got good contacts with the national people. We can get people here. Yeah.
Okay, so I will take that, and thank you for spotted a message that came up and said we're happy for you to continue. I will take that as the view of everybody. Gretel has to make a very brief just sort of statement about our finances at the moment. So I'll hand over to Gretel.
Afternoon, everyone. We're currently in a very positive position. We have 7,107. No, we haven't. I'm lying. We've got £4,173.
Okay.
And we can use that to put events on. Obviously, they don't really cost as much when we're in a time of COVID, but we can bring speakers up, we can put training sessions on. It's just whatever people can cope with, because if you're anything like me, I can't cope with anything else that's not COVID and organisational minded focused at the minute. But into the future, we can pay for a series of events, a speaker on wellbeing, a speaker on something developmental. We just need suggestions, really, because we don't want to put something on that's either going to fall flat or not be of use to people, especially in recovery times in 2021. We can also put on events for assistant and deputy heads, middle leaders, because NAHT is a leadership union right across the board. And we've got good speakers on, I put down some things. We can do tricky conversations, we can do dealing with parental complaints, we can do aspiring and upwards in leadership for those middle leaders and assistants and deputies. We can put something on about well-being. We just need people to suggest, but we don't want to put something on unnecessarily.
Okay, could I just add something else as well, Judy? You'll have heard me say this on a number of occasions at Calderdale Primary Heads Association meetings, but I'm going to repeat it, and you'll hear me say it again and again. But when I retired from headship, I was head of a 3-form entry primary in a tough inner city area in Bradford 4 years ago, and I retired. And when I retired and took up this role, most of my work was to do with the sort of HR, employment law sort of issues like grievances, complaints, you know, restructuring, redundancies, people having difficult outcomes from Ofsted, and issues around governance. So I was dealing with that a lot. Most recently, the things that I've been dealing with are people just phoning me up ahead of anything escalating and saying, Rob, this is a situation I'm in. What do you think I should do? Or I'm thinking of doing this. What's your thoughts on it? And I can't always give you the definitive answer straight away, but I can always contact somebody who can, usually from either from Judy or the other colleagues on the exec, or from NAHT HQ, and I can get an answer for you, and just share information and ideas. What we found is hitting those things early avoids things escalating. So if you do have a situation that is developing, or you've got a concern, or you just want to talk something through, you know, by all means contact me. You know, things are confidential, and I never look. I've had too much experience myself as a head teacher to know that there's none of us who doesn't have a difficult situation at some point or another. And, you know, so don't ever think by contacting me, I'm going to think, oh, you're failing, because I most certainly won't. So please, you know, I'm there for you. Get in touch. My contact details I'll make available in a follow-up to this. Many of you have already got them, but I'll repeat them again. And I know that the other members of the exec, Judy, David, Gretel, are also there for you as well. So, but look after yourselves. Take notice of what Sinead said. It's very, very important that you look after yourselves, because if you don't look after yourselves, you won't be able to look after all your children, your staff, your families. Okay, thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Is there any other official business we have to cover, Natalie? Or does that make up for a really condensed AGM?
No, we've had the finances, we've had the update from the secretary, so
we got it in, and that's another year done. But please do think about joining us and keeping in touch. And just a huge thank you to everybody who joined us. I hope you have found it relevant, useful. You've taken a quiet moment. Look after yourselves. We are elite athletes in what we do, and elite athletes have to be look after themselves physically and mentally. There's never been a more prescient time to do that. And let's cling on to the fact that at some point this will all be over. I don't think it's going to be immediate, but it will be soon. So thank you, and see you all soon.
Okay.
thank you.